Brooklyn's hands shook as she scanned the groceries, her broken arms barely hanging on despite the makeshift bandages wrapped around them. "She's bleeding in front of us, and you still don't care?" Her voice cracked, snapping the tension in the air. The customers behind her paused, frozen, confused. Brooklyn had no choice but to keep working, but the pain, the exhaustion, it was too much. The weight of it all came crashing down in an instant. Behind the register at a busy H-E-B in downtown Houston, Brooklyn tried to hide the bruises and the agony she felt. The rush of customers only added to her stress, but the pain from her broken arms was unbearable. Her eyes darted to the supervisor, who barely noticed her distress. But she wasn't alone. A man in a faded blue cap stood watching her, and his question hit her like a bolt of lightning. "Why don't you tell anyone what's really going on?" The man wasn't just another customer, Alexander Mills. And that question, those words, would change both their lives forever. Brooklyn, struggling to breathe through the tears, didn't know it yet, but that one question would unravel everything she thought she knew about survival, and Alexander would never be the same again. Welcome back, my family. I'm truly happy to have you here again today. Thank you for your support, your kindness, and your beautiful comments. They're the reason I keep creating these stories every single day. Before we begin, I want to speak a quick blessing over everyone watching. I'm wishing you peace in your mind, strength in your spirit, and favor in everything your hands touch. May your home be filled with calm, protection, and unexpected blessings. And from my heart to yours, Merry Christmas in advance. May this season bring you healing, joy, and new beginnings. If you're watching and you haven't subscribed yet, please take a moment to do so. Your subscription, your likes, and your shares to friends and family help this channel grow and stay alive. And I would truly love for you to be part of this journey with us. Now, thank you again for being here. Let's get into today's story. Brooklyn's silence had been her only armor, her only defense against a world that never bothered to ask what she was going through. But as she wiped the tears from her eyes, she realized that her life at home in Houston's East End wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a war that she couldn't fight alone. And Alexander, who had walked in unaware, would soon understand that. She had always kept her pain hidden, buried beneath her stoic expressions and polite smiles. When people asked how she was, she gave the same response: "I'm fine, just tired." No one had ever pushed beyond that surface answer. No one had ever seen the truth, how she was barely holding herself together, how her world outside of H-E-B was a constant storm. Brooklyn lived in a cramped apartment, far from the shiny new condos, sprouting up in downtown Houston. Her neighborhood was the kind of place people tried to escape from. Run-down streets lined with peeling paint and empty lots. Tyrone, her boyfriend of 3 years, had always been unpredictable, but lately the anger had taken a darker turn. He didn't need a reason to lash out. It could be something as small as a misplaced comment or nothing at all. The first time he hit her, Brooklyn had been in shock. The pain, the confusion, it all blurred together. She couldn't understand how the man she trusted could hurt her like that. But then he apologized, promised it would never happen again. She believed him because she didn't know any better. She thought love was supposed to be complicated. That's what they told her. How love was messy, rough around the edges. Maybe it was all part of the deal, but it wasn't. And Tyrone knew exactly how to keep her quiet, how to make her feel like she was nothing without him. The broken bones? They were just reminders. The bruises? They were hidden beneath layers of clothes, and the makeup covered the marks on her face. And the worst part? She had learned to hide it from everyone, even here at work. Her job at HEB was the only thing that kept her going. When she clocked in, it was like she could breathe again. For a few hours, the weight of the world, Tyrone, the abuse, the suffocating silence, disappeared. But even here, she wasn't free. Brooklyn kept a fragile smile plastered on her face, pretending everything was fine, as she scanned groceries and made small talk with customers. Each day, it became harder to keep the mask up. But no one asked. No one cared. As the shift came to an end, Brooklyn's exhaustion weighed on her. She couldn't wait to get home. But as soon as the door to their apartment closed behind her, she knew what was coming. Tyrone would be there, waiting, and the cycle would repeat itself again and again. That night, as Brooklyn sat silently in the corner of the apartment, her arms throbbing and her heart breaking, she wondered just how much longer she could keep pretending. You won't believe what happens when Brooklyn finally speaks out. Some stories go untold for far too long. Subscribe to witness the truth unfold. Alexander Mills stood in the back of HEB, blending in like just another customer, his faded blue cap pulled low over his eyes. The bustling store around him felt ordinary, yet it wasn't. He wasn't here to shop. He was here to observe. As CEO of the chain, he'd gone undercover to see the truth behind the polished reports, the spreadsheets that painted a perfect picture. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to witness. Brooklyn was just another cashier in the system, another face in the crowd. At least, that's what Alexander had thought. But something about her caught his attention. From the moment she greeted him at the register, he noticed the way she grimaced as she moved, how her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The cast on her arm was the first clue. The second was the tightness in her posture, the strain in her every movement, like a woman holding herself together by sheer will. Alexander's gaze lingered for a moment too long. His mind raced. He watched her, quietly observing the way she struggled to hide the pain. She shouldn't have to be like this. His instincts kicked in, but the voice in his head reminded him that he was supposed to stay detached, to gather intel and keep moving. But with every second that passed, the rules felt less important. The truth was staring him in the face. And it wasn't just about corporate policy anymore. When the boss sees the truth, it changes everything. Will Alexander take action? Hit subscribe so you don't miss the moment he finds out what's really happening in his stores. Alexander stood at the register, his eyes fixed on Brooklyn as she carefully scanned items, her movements slow and strained. He had seen enough, more than enough. It was clear now that the pain she was hiding went beyond just a broken arm. There was something deeper, something darker. The store buzzed around them, but in that moment, everything felt silent. Alexander took a breath, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to ask. He leaned in slightly, keeping his voice low so only she could hear. The words hung in the air, sharper than he had intended. Brooklyn froze. Her eyes locked on him, wide with shock, her body trembling. For a moment she said nothing. The question, so simple yet so loaded, broke through the barrier she had so carefully built around herself. Her heart raced and her throat tightened. She couldn't speak. Not yet. And then, without warning, the floodgates opened. Brooklyn's face crumpled as the weight of her pain poured out in waves. She struggled to catch her breath as tears filled her eyes. I've been hiding it. I didn't want anyone to know. I didn't want to be weak. I didn't want to lose my job, she whispered, her voice breaking with every word. But he hurts me. The confession felt like a release, but it was also terrifying. She had never said it out loud before. Alexander's shock was palpable, but his voice was steady. "You don't have to hide anymore," he said softly, his hand hovering near her arm in a gesture of comfort. "One question, one moment, everything changes. What will Brooklyn do next?" The road to healing is never easy, but it begins with speaking the truth. Subscribe to find out how this conversation transforms their lives. Brooklyn's admission had shattered the wall she'd built around herself, but it also sent ripples through everything she knew. The weight of her words hung between them as Alexander listened, his shock transforming into something deeper, something akin to guilt. He hadn't expected to hear this, not from her, not from anyone in his stores. But as the days passed, it became clear that Brooklyn's pain was not just hers alone. It was a symptom of something bigger, something that stretched far beyond the walls of this store. Alexander began to look at his company with new eyes. What he had once dismissed as minor issues now stood out in glaring detail. Understaffing, overworked employees, low wages that barely kept people afloat, and managers who turned a blind eye to the suffering they caused. Brooklyn wasn't just a victim of her personal circumstances, she was one of many suffering in a broken system. Brooklyn, for the first time in years, felt a flicker of hope. The truth had set her free, but it had also opened a terrifying new door. Speaking out had made her vulnerable. Now everyone would know. She could no longer hide. But there was also something freeing in the vulnerability. She no longer had to pretend. She wasn't alone anymore. Still, the thought of what would come next kept her awake at night. Would Tyrone retaliate when he found out she had told someone? Would her coworkers see her as weak? As Brooklyn struggled with the aftermath, Alexander made his own decisions. The company couldn't go on this way. There would be changes. This is where it all starts. The truth has a way of spreading. If you believe in standing up for the truth, subscribe now and join us as Alexander takes the next steps. The weight of Brooklyn's confession lingered in Alexander's mind long after he'd left the store. He had gone undercover to observe, to find inefficiencies, to improve his company's bottom line. But now, everything had changed. Brooklyn's pain wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a symptom of a much larger issue. Alexander couldn't ignore it. He couldn't go back to pretending that his company's success was enough to justify the suffering of its employees. The cracks he had seen at HEB, the underpaid workers, the overburdened staff, the managers who allowed toxic environments to thrive, were impossible to ignore. It was all connected. Without hesitation, Alexander called the store manager James into his office. The conversation was short but impactful. James had known about the conditions in the store. He had seen the signs and turned a blind eye. "You're fired," Alexander said, his voice firm. "You've allowed an abusive environment to take root under your watch. That stops now." The decision was not an easy one. Alexander had built his empire on profitability, on systems designed to maximize efficiency, often at the expense of human compassion. But now, with Brooklyn's story ringing in his ears, the reality of his responsibility hit him hard. He was more than just a CEO. He was a person, and his decisions had consequences. At the next corporate meeting, Alexander presented his plan for reform: increased pay, better health benefits, more resources for employee mental health, and a zero-tolerance policy for abuse in any form. He knew the resistance would be fierce, but this was the right thing to do. Corporate change isn't easy, but sometimes it's necessary. Witness the shift firsthand. Subscribe to see how one CEO decided to make the world better for his employees. Brooklyn never imagined this would happen. Not for someone like her. When Alexander approached her after their conversation at the register, his words took her by surprise. "I want to help," he said quietly, his voice steady. "You shouldn't have to go through this alone." His offer was simple but life-changing. Medical care to heal her broken arm, counseling to help her deal with the trauma, and legal aid to break free from Tyrone's grip. But what hit Brooklyn hardest wasn't the promise of resources. It was the fact that someone truly saw her. For the first time, someone cared. She had spent years hiding her pain, bearing it under layers of self-doubt. The thought of accepting help felt foreign, even wrong. She had always believed she wasn't worthy of kindness, not after everything she had endured. But Alexander's genuine offer shook that belief to its core. Her heart raced with fear. Was this really happening? Could she really leave Tyrone behind? Could she rebuild her life one step at a time? But the thought of a future without fear, a future where she could breathe without looking over her shoulder, filled her with something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Alexander's words were a lifeline, a tangible promise of a different life. Brooklyn didn't have all the answers, but for the first time she felt that maybe, just maybe, she could have something better. Her hand shook as she reached for the paperwork Alexander had laid out in front of her. She wasn't alone anymore. For the first time, Brooklyn has a chance at a new life. If you believe that everyone deserves a second chance, subscribe now. Stand with Brooklyn as she finds her way out of the darkness. Brooklyn's first therapy session was the hardest thing she had ever done. Sitting across from a stranger, she felt exposed, raw, as if every part of her past was being peeled away. But each session, though painful, felt like a step toward something better, a future where she wasn't constantly running from the past. She enrolled in a support group for women who had survived abuse. And slowly, she began to understand that she wasn't alone. For so long, she had carried the weight of Tyrone's cruelty in silence, believing she was the only one. But now, surrounded by women who had walked similar paths, Brooklyn started to realize her strength. She wasn't broken. She was healing. Alexander checked in with her every week, offering quiet support and practical help. He helped her navigate the legal process, making sure she had the resources to file for a restraining order and take control of her life. He never pushed. He simply guided, offering a steady hand when she needed it most. Their relationship, once purely transactional, had evolved. Brooklyn now saw Alexander as more than the CEO of HEB. He was an ally, someone who believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. And Alexander, for the first time, realized that his role as a leader went beyond profit margins and boardroom decisions. It was about real people, real lives. Brooklyn wasn't defined by the man who had tried to control her. She was defined by her resilience. Healing isn't instant, but it begins with hope. Subscribe to see Brooklyn's incredible journey and how Alexander helps change her life forever. Brooklyn stood outside the cafe, the cool breeze brushing against her face as she looked at the small college campus before her. She was finally free. Free from Tyrone. Free from the pain that had once consumed her every waking moment. She had a new job now, one that treated her with respect. And for the first time, she was working toward her future, not just surviving it. She had enrolled in college, determined to build a career for herself, to prove to herself that she was capable of so much more than she had ever believed. She was no longer the girl who hid her bruises under layers of makeup and lies. Brooklyn was now a woman in control of her life, and every step forward felt like a victory. Alexander's efforts to reform HEB were now paying off. Employee satisfaction was up, wages had been increased, and support systems had been implemented company-wide. He had pushed for change, and it had made a difference, not just for Brooklyn, but for every worker in the company. The systems that once prioritized profits above people were now centered on their well-being. They met one last time in a quiet corner of the cafe. Brooklyn smiled, a genuine smile, one that came from a place of strength, not fear. She was no longer defined by the scars of her past. Alexander, too, had changed. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was someone who understood the real cost of corporate decisions. Their paths had crossed for a reason, and now both had new futures ahead. Futures built on compassion, change, and redemption. This is where their story ends, but your journey is just beginning. Subscribe to see the impact of empathy and change in the real world. Brooklyn and Alexander proved that one person can make a difference. Will you? Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.